Why are there so many angels in 90s, anime and Japanese video games? Evangelion, Final Fantasy, Trigun. It doesn't matter the story or the genre. There's always an angel somewhere. But why? Japan is a country where less than 1% of the population is Catholic. So why this obsession? What does this strange fascination reveal about Japanese culture? And how can answering these questions help us understand the current state of the world and where it might be heading, for better or for worse? But before we answer any of those questions, we first need to understand the following. If you look online and try to research how religious people are in Japan, you'll see something curious in the various surveys. You'll see that more than 90% of Japanese people identify as Shinto or Buddhist. In other words, religious. However, you'll also see that in other surveys, more than 70% of Japanese people say they're not religious. And if you're wondering, both surveys are accurate and real. So what's happening here? How can both things that are the opposite of each other be true at the same time? Well, to answer that, we first need to go back to the 3rd century Japan. Today, the most popular religion in Japan is Shintoism. This is where most of the temples and rituals you see in so many anime come from. There are many theories and opinions about when it was created, but most agree that by the 3rd century, it already existed in one form or another. The reason it's so difficult to pinpoint the exact moment it was born is because it's a very decentralized and organic religion. Unlike religions such as Christianity or Buddhism, there's no single founder. There are important books, but no one sacred text, and there's no central authority like the Vatican. Shintoism began simply as the spiritual beliefs of ancient Japanese peoples. The central idea was that everything in nature has a spirit. Mountains, rivers, trees, rocks, animals, weather phenomena. These spirits are known as kami. They're not gods in the Western sense, but sacred presences that can be protective, temperamental, or simply part of the environment. Over time, these beliefs gave rise to an enormous number of regional, local, and even family gods. You can see this concept represented in anime like Dandadan, where they show how, outside certain prefectures, the Japanese equivalent of states, or specific zones, some rituals lose their power, or how many yokai, Japanese demons or spirits, aliens and entities depend on where they are to manifest or not. Each community had, and many still have, its own protective spirits, rituals, and stories. Instead of a single god, Shintoism recognizes thousands of gods. In fact, there's a very famous saying, Yaoyorozu no Kami, which translates to the 8 million gods. It doesn't literally mean there are 8 million, but it's a poetic way of saying there are spirits everywhere, that the world is full of countless divinities. This phrase reflects very well how the sacred is understood in Shintoism. Gods are common, everyday, and close, not unique and distant entities as often occurs in many Western religions. In Shintoism, a god doesn't have to be something extraordinary. A god can be a mountain, a tree, a river, a rock, a fox, a natural phenomenon, or even an object that, over time, developed a spirit. All these gods have different functions, personalities, and characteristics, forming an immense divine universe deeply connected to daily life. Over time, the practice of Shintoism became more established, unified, and organized. The first shrines were built, rituals were formalized, and some traditions were standardized. Even so, Shintoism never lost its flexible and local essence. That's why it's more than a rigid religion. It's a set of spiritual practices linked to nature and community. Now, when Buddhism arrived in Japan in the 6th century from Korea, it didn't replace Shintoism, despite what you might think. Instead of competing, both religions began to mix very naturally. The Japanese saw no contradiction in worshipping the kami of Shintoism while simultaneously following Buddhist teachings. To them, Buddha was just another god among the many they already had. This mixture is known as Shinbutsu Shugo. Shinto and Buddhist shrines and temples were built side by side, and many people freely practiced rituals from both traditions without making any distinction. As I mentioned, there was no central authority telling people the right or wrong way to practice Shinto, so there wasn't anyone shouting blasphemy at the sight of the two religions blending together. To be honest, it was all a bit more based on vibes. For almost 1200 years, Shintoism and Buddhism were so fused that it was difficult for many people to distinguish them. That is, until 1868 with the Meiji Restoration. You don't need to fully understand what the Meiji Restoration was, but here's the short version. Japan was closed off to the rest of the world for almost 300 years, an era known as Edo. That's the same era where Samurai Champloo takes place. With small exceptions, no one could enter or leave Japan. The Meiji Restoration came to change that, to open Japan to the world and rapidly industrialize it. To do this, Japan drew inspiration from several of the most powerful Western nations of the time, mainly European ones like Germany. In fact, I have a whole video explaining all this and why you see so much German culture in anime. The point is this: Japan was trying to imitate the West in many aspects, and one of the most important aspects to understanding Western societies is their religion, which in the vast majority of Western nations tends to be a type of Christianity or is related to it. By the way, if you like Rurouni Kenshin, also known as as Samurai X, the Meiji Restoration is when that story takes place. It's important to note that by the late 1800s, during the Meiji Restoration, Japan was already quite familiar with Christianity. It all began in 1549, when Francis Xavier introduced it to the archipelago on behalf of the Catholic Church. And surprisingly, Christianity became relatively popular in Japan. Just as happened with Buddhism centuries earlier, many Japanese saw Jesus simply as another of the many gods that already existed, only with the bonus of eternal salvation, which attracted a lot of attention. For a time, Christians were even protected by powerful figures like Oda Nobunaga. Yes, that character who appears in 99% of historical anime. But over the years, things changed. Some Christians began to reject and attack Shintoism, which generated religious and social tensions. Eventually, Christianity's accelerated growth, combined with its connection to foreign colonial powers, set off alarms among Japanese leaders. The authorities began to see the religion as a political and cultural threat. In 1587, Toyotomi Hideyoshi issued the Batran Edict, which ordered the expulsion of Jesuit fathers and missionaries and prohibited Christian preaching in Japan. That was the beginning of a long series of persecutions. You can see this represented in anime like Samurai Champloo, where they show how people were forced to step on an image of Jesus to prove they weren't Christians. And if they didn't step on it, well, you can imagine. This continued for more than 200 years, including during the Edo period, when Japan remained closed to the rest of the world. During this time, Christianity was practiced almost entirely in secret. This changed in 1868 with the Meiji Restoration, when Japan reopened its doors to the world and began a process of accelerated modernization to catch up with Western powers. As part of this transformation, the government had to rethink its stance toward foreign religions. And in 1873, it officially lifted the ban on Christianity, ending more than 2 centuries of persecution, not out of sudden sympathy for the faith, but because Japan needed to prove to the United States and Europe that it was now a civilized nation capable of guaranteeing religious freedom. Diplomatic pressure played a huge role. However, this didn't mean Japan became a country where religion and government were separate like in the West. In fact, something very particular happened. While the government allowed people to practice Christianity and other religions, it reorganized Shintoism and turned it into the official religion of the state. Now, Shintoism wasn't presented as a religion, but as a national tradition, a cultural identity that reinforced the emperor's authority. It was a way to unify the country and strengthen the idea that all Japanese shared common spiritual roots. During the Meiji era, Shintoism stopped being seen as just a traditional belief system and became the cultural foundation of the new Japanese state. It was in this context that gods like Amaterasu were officialized in a modern sense, no longer just as mythological figures recorded in ancient texts like the Kojiki, but as state symbols actively promoted by the government. Thanks to this, they began appearing in school textbooks, presented almost as historical characters that explained the origin of the islands, nature, and the imperial family. Children grew up learning that these gods were linked to mountains, rivers, harvests, and everyday festivities, as if they coexisted with them in their daily environment. This reinforced the idea that the divine could manifest anywhere, in an ancient tree, in a rock, in a storm, or in the neighborhood shrine. And a few decades later, in 1945, came World War II and the 2 nuclear bombs. I don't think I need to say how horrible this event was, and how it changed Japan forever. Suddenly, none of the hundreds of gods Japan had came to their rescue, and as if that weren't enough, the emperor, that figure who was said to literally be a descendant of Amaterasu, their greatest deity, who had led them into a horrible and bloody war, was telling them he was surrendering. This figure, who was almost a god, suddenly turned out to be just another ordinary human like everyone else. To give you an idea of how big of a deal this was, the radio address Emperor Hirohito gave, announcing the surrender, was known as the Jewel Voice Broadcast. It was called that because the emperor's voice was considered precious or sacred, like an imperial jewel. But I guess all that glitters isn't gold, right? I think it's natural to imagine how someone, after living through this, might come to the conclusion that maybe this whole god thing is a lie, or at least to question it. I mean, finding out that almost 200,000 people stopped existing without leaving any trace in just a matter of seconds is something. And as if that weren't enough, the USA arrived and began taking control of the government. In the eyes of some, this could have been seen as another false god. Here comes another big, powerful figure saying they're here to help and protect us. And look, I don't think I need to tell you how the United States made some questionable decisions and didn't fulfill many people's hopes. The point is this: I could go deeper and explain how, after the Ritsuryo state system collapsed, the daimyo, feudal lords, began sponsoring shrines, turning Shinto practices into large community events. But then, in the Middle Ages, things shifted. Shinto worship became more more individual, centered on personal prayers rather than big social gatherings. And later, in the Edo era, the pendulum swung again. Thanks to better transportation and public safety, long-distance pilgrimages became massively popular, blending religion, tourism, and entertainment as millions traveled to major shrines. I could say all of that and more. But what's important to understand is this. If we observe the evolution of religion in Japan, it's clear it has never been static. It's always changing, adjusting, mixing, removing, and adding elements. It merges with other religions in such extreme ways that, honestly, I don't know of another culture where something similar has occurred. At least not at this level. Religion in Japan constantly changes the way it lives. One day, a certain practice is a group celebration. Then it becomes something you must do alone. Today it's allowed, tomorrow it's forbidden, and the day after it might appear in textbooks as true history. Nothing is sacred in the sense of staying the same forever. Everything eventually changes. And this matters not only because Japanese beliefs evolved over time, but also because, from very early on, the idea of a god in Japan was completely different from the distant, all-powerful figure we're used to in the West. A kami wasn't far away or unreachable. It was close, every day, even visible. A tree, a mountain, a river, a natural phenomenon. This is reflected today in a lot of anime and Japanese video games. Final Fantasy, Saint Seiya, Konosuba, where we see stories about killing gods, or gods that are clumsy, weak beings, or simply characters you can joke around with and then have a beer with. In other words, they're very human. They're born, feel, desire, cry, and die. In essence, what a god is in Japan is always changing because its definition is relatively vague, more based on vibes than rigid rules. Yes, there currently exists an organization that works with the government and groups together more than 80,000 Shinto temples, but it's a decentralized network. Each temple administers its own rituals and tradition. Additionally, a temple can be anything from an imposing building to literally a rock in the middle of the sea. There are also multiple versions of Shintoism. There's no single true Shintoism. And although religion in almost any part of the world has been modified by governments according to their convenience, those modifications are usually limited by the influence of other nations. For example, and I use Christianity because I know most people watching my videos are familiar with it. A Spanish king could adjust things to his convenience, but at the same time, the French or English would also intervene, so there were limits. Some pushed one way and others the opposite way. In Japan, this wasn't the case with Shintoism. Since it developed on an island that was geographically and culturally isolated from most other nations, and later literally closed to the outside world for centuries, its beliefs grew almost entirely within a single environment. And even though Japan wasn't always a unified country, the people across its regions still shared, in most cases, a similar language, many traditions, and a broadly similar worldview. And once the nation unified, this became even stronger. That's why Shintoism, unlike Christianity in Europe, didn't split into multiple versions shaped by different countries. It remained tied to the same internal structure, the same ruling power, and the same cultural background. Religion in Japan started from a very flexible base, which allowed it to change and adapt easily, and this flexibility has carried over to the present. Today, religious beliefs and practices in Japan are far less rigid than in many countries in the West, and this issue of religion in Japan not being lived with the same institutional seriousness as in the West becomes even more apparent when you discover that those more than 80,000 Shinto temples I mentioned are technically no longer considered religious places. After World War II, when Japan had to completely separate the state from any religious practice, mainly due to the influence of the United States, the government reclassified these temples. So today, unlike Catholic churches or Buddhist temples located in Japan, a Shinto temple is considered a cultural space, not a religious one in the eyes of the government. And maybe you're thinking right now, very nice history lesson and all, but where do angels come into all this? We've only been talking about gods, and angels aren't gods. And as I said at the beginning, today less than 1% of Japanese people are Christian. So then again, why Christianity? And why angels? Well, to understand the next chapter of the story, we need to go to the 1980s. But first, just a reminder that I have a Patreon where you can support the channel and get some pretty cool perks. Now back to the 80s. In the 80s, Japan was the second largest superpower in the world, more or less like what China is today. The Japanese economy was booming, the standard of living was rising rapidly, and it seemed like everything was going up without breaks. But then the 90s arrived, and everything came crashing down like nothing the world had ever seen before. Millions of people lost their money, their jobs, and even their homes. And because of some unique quirks in how Japan's government and and large companies operate, which I talk about in more depth in this video, young people entering the job market at that time never had a chance to climb the economic ladder. This period became known as the Lost Decade, because for the entire decade, things remained stagnant, without improving. Now you add the death of the emperor, the fact that North Korea was sending missiles near the coast of Japan, a toxic gas attack on a train by a cult, and, almost as if to add insult to injury, a devastating earthquake that cost the lives of hundreds. For a Japanese person at that time, it basically felt like the world was ending. And as you can imagine, people felt sad, anxious, or depressed. Basically what you're probably feeling right now, but even worse. As a result of all this, people began seeking escapist stories that would take them to other worlds where life didn't suck as much, or that at least gave them some hope for a better future. And one of the ways to satisfy that need for positivity or purpose in their lives was religion. Since the 70s and 80s, you could already see a rise in these kinds of trends, with many cults appearing. But in the 90s, cults and new religious movements exploded even more, especially as a result of the Lost Decade. In other words, the Japanese public was searching for something to fulfill their spiritual needs. And while they weren't Christians, they were familiar with the religion, though perhaps not in the way you might expect. You see, after the war, Western culture began to be seen as cooler or more exotic for new generations, especially those who grew up in a Japan heavily influenced by the United States after World War II. The presence of American troops, along with the massive arrival of movies, music, and Western fashion, created a cultural fascination that continues to this day. That's why there are subcultures in Japan like Japanese Chicanos or Japanese cowboys, and that's why in many anime you can see them using English words even when a Japanese word already exists that means exactly the same thing. English sounded modern, international, and a bit more trendy. That same logic explains why, in the early 2000s, more Japanese people began getting married in Catholic weddings than in traditional Japanese weddings. The Western aesthetic had an aspirational aura, but many of those ceremonies weren't really Catholic. They were chapels designed to look like churches, with European or American men acting as priests. The couples knew this perfectly well, and were still completely fine with it, because what they were looking for wasn't the religious sacrament, but the Western aesthetic and symbolism they considered elegant, romantic, or simply cooler. There's even a saying that sums up this dynamic. Japanese people have 3 religions throughout their lives. They're born Shinto, marry Catholic, and die Buddhist. This shows that religion isn't exactly a big deal there. It's more like a cultural or traditional thing people do, because that's how they were born and raised. That's why the figures from the beginning didn't add up. The famous 90% reported as Buddhist or Shinto comes from surveys done at temples. And of course, if you ask the temples, they're going to tell you that almost everyone is a believer. Look how many people visit us and pray here every day. But if you ask a normal Japanese person directly, most will tell you they're not believers, because what they do is more tradition than faith. I think the best way to understand it is to compare it to horoscopes or superstitions. Very likely a part of you doesn't believe in that, but another part maybe thinks, well, you never know. I bet you have your lucky item or number for the lottery, or you even check your horoscope from time to time. In Japan, it works the same way. They don't necessarily believe, but they participate, repeat the rituals, and use the symbols because they're part of their culture. All of this helps us understand how, in Japan, you don't necessarily have to believe in something to use it as a symbol, or take part in a religious ritual. And what are angels, if not a religious symbol of peace and hope? Exactly what people needed to hear at a time when national morale was at rock bottom. They were used in the same way we often see Buddhism in media, as a way to convey peace or balance. But this isn't the end of the story, nor the final reason why you saw so much angels in 90s anime and Japanese video games. Japan's Lost Decade turned into the Lost Decades, and the country has never fully recovered from the economic crisis of the 1990s. Even today, it's hard to see how Japan will escape its current situation. It now has the highest government debt in the world, owing more than 2.5 times what the country produces in a year, and it's difficult to see a clear path forward. And that's not all. Today, many people believe Japan is not an isolated case, but rather a warning sign, a canary in the coal mine. In fact, many countries around the world, especially in the so-called West, are starting to show some of the same warning signs Japan showed in the 1990s, such as rising national debt, expensive housing, young people feeling shut out of opportunities, and stock markets that may be overvalued or unstable. Because of this, people have begun talking about a possible Western Lost Decade. This may not come as a surprise if you've been paying attention to the problems our world has been facing in recent years, or if you've simply been living through them, which might help explain the explosion of interest in 90s anime series and 90s anime aesthetics in the West. As the future has started to feel uncertain, many people have begun looking back at the past with nostalgia, even for a version of the past that never really existed. But that imagined past expresses many of the same feelings people are experiencing today. I am talking about anime like Evangelion, possibly the most important anime in all of history, which took the Catholic aesthetic that Ultraman occasionally used and took it to the maximum, further popularizing these symbols. And what do you know? Suddenly, you start seeing angels everywhere. And of course, eventually variants emerged like dark angels, a more edgy twist on the original concept. But in the end, they all come from the same place, a nation searching for hope in borrowed wings.